I'm gonna our recordings, just a reminder, the recording is just internal purposes for anyone who wasn't able to join to be able from this class, register in this course specifically to catch up. So hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of Freedom is the Future. We're very excited. I'm very excited for this session, and I hope all of you, I know all of you are going to hopefully benefit a lot and walk away with kind of what Brian said, is some like concrete, tangible ways and talking points to combat a lot of the Zionist myths, historical myths that we see continuing and in present day. So it's not just something, again, like history, it's not just something that happened in the past and is not, especially in Palestinian history, isn't affecting present day. All of Palestinian history is continues to affect present day reality in Palestine, and especially when talking about things like the Nakba, which we'll learn in more detail. That's not an event that happened, that's over. That's something that we say is ongoing and is very deliberate to acknowledge as something that's ongoing. So all of this will weave into a lot of what's happening right now in Palestine. Before we get started, does anyone have questions, comments, concerns, feelings, things that came up? I'm not going to do like everyone going around check-in. I'm just going to offer up the space for a minute or two. And then I also want to remind everyone, I was going to check it right before, I didn't get a chance, but if you all could remember to fill up the sign-up sheet to make a testimonial video that we can use. I put the Google Doc on in the classroom and in the WhatsApp group. I'll take a look at it in a little bit, but please remember, that's really going to help us out if you could just do a very quick 30-second testimonial about what you learned from each week. Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity, since I've joined late and everybody might be wondering who the heck is this guy.
I'm so familiar with you, I didn't even think about it.
I'm Brian Ford, he, him. I live in Montclair, New Jersey. I'm a social justice educator, high school history teacher. I am a member of both the National and North New Jersey DSA, BDS, and Palestine Solidarity Working Group, where nationally I work a lot on the political education side. I'm a member of the National Black Lives Matter at School curriculum team and Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies, which is, holding firm that against attacks from Zionists as well, and a bunch of other things that I'm involved in, yeah, just love PAC and love to support, and just looking to learn in community with y'all, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brian. We're excited to have you join. Anyone else before we get started? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen for this portion. Share my screen. Just to remind us where we are in Rania's beautiful caterpillar towards, I don't know if I'll call it, I don't know. What is it? What's the official name? I forgot. Or caterpillar of our class, where we're at now. So we started with identity, with culture, and today we are focusing on history. We are kind of splitting the historical part and the myths into we used to do them in 2 parts, but what we're doing now is this session is going to dive more intensely into the history, and the next session is going to kind of help us contextualize how, like what I was saying earlier, what we learned in this session is really happening still on the ground, and is still, the realities of it or effects of it are unfolding on the ground in Palestine still. So definitely, if you want to take some notes or keep a lot of what we're talking about today in mind for next session course. Our agenda for today, we're going to watch a video that's just going to give us a nice quick overview of Palestinian history. Obviously, it's not going to cover everything, and it's not going to cover everything exactly well, but we figured it's good, since we're all coming from different places and understandings of key historical moments in Palestinian history. It will just kind of give us a good grounding foundation to start off with. then I will officially welcome our guest speaker for today. And we're just, he's going to dive into some key dates in Palestine's history, again, through the context of specifically these 6 myths that you can find in the book. If anyone needs access or is very interested in reading the book but can't access it, please just let us know and we're happy to help you do that. So I'm going to start us with the video. We're not going to watch the whole video. We'll finish this next week.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about 2 groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in 2 important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling in farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into 2 separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. But the Jews accepted the plan and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war. But in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1970.
Okay, so I stopped it there because this is the time period that we're going to be discussing today. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in that video, a lot to critique, disagree with, agree with, but just wanted to give a foundational grounding for all of us. If you have questions or comments or feelings about this video or critiques, please put them in the chat and we can unpack them and talk through them as we go through this session and next week's session.
One of the
To get us started, and without further ado, it is our pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Jihad Abu Salim, who is the Education and Policy Coordinator of the Palestine Activism Program at the American Friends Service Committee. He is also the co-editor of Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire, which will be, I think, is published by Haymarket, was published this year. Jihad is currently completing his PhD in the History in Hebrew and Judaic Studies Joint Program at New York University. His research focuses on Arab and Palestinian writings on Zionism from the pre-Nakba era, and he also writes about Gaza's past, present, and future, with a focus on how the continuation of the Nakba impacts Palestinians in Gaza and beyond. Jihad's work has been featured in publications such as The Washington Post, Al Jazeera, The New Arab, and Vox. So I think his bio speaks enough to why we continue to ask him to do the same topic of this course each year. And also Jihad's just a great friend and colleague of PAC. So Jihad, the floor is all yours, and let me know if you'd prefer if I continue sharing screen, and you let me know next slide, or if you would like to.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And again, hi everyone, good to be with you all. I think I will ask for next slide, just, so that we don't have any potential logistical issues. And before I start, I'm really grateful for PAC for organizing this class again. It's always a pleasure to join you and to be part of this important conversation about Palestine. I don't claim that I will be able to cover all the history tonight. I chose to focus on certain themes and issues that based on my experience in academia and as an activist, I thought they would be very important to highlight. And in preparing today's presentation, which I will talk to you about, I realized there are many slides, a lot of, bits and pieces of information here and there, but I will try my best to, make it fun. And I realized that everybody has muted their mic. A big part of tonight's conversation will include me asking questions, so please, go for it. Just don't shy away from raising your hand, because I have I have this like line of participants on top, and then I have the shared screen. Unable to see who raises their hand, so Abir, if you could help me with that. Feel free to stop me at any point if people have any questions, and of course, during parts where I will be asking questions, I'll make sure I'll be mindful to wait and see if people would like to answer. Of course, you're more than welcome to write things in the chat. So yeah, let's start. Next slide, please. So tonight's presentation I chose this title intentionally because I feel like, for us as Palestinians and for our friends and allies and those who are advocating for us, the idea of Palestine as a country, as a place, with everything that it represents in terms of history, in terms of culture and heritage and symbols for a lot of people from different backgrounds, is something that is ever evolving and ever changing, and is very rich, simple to understand, but complex at the same time. So I chose to title this presentation Understanding Palestine, because as a Palestinian and as someone who studies Palestine, for me, discovering and rediscovering what it means to be Palestinian, and learning about this identity and what it represents for me, for my family, for my friends, for Palestinians who live in the diaspora, for Palestinians who live in the homeland. These are different things and can mean different things at different times for different people. Of course, we're united by major shared experiences, but I believe this is an ongoing process that we engage in by choice or not, from the moment we're born. Also because of the nature of our existence as people who, I will talk about this in a minute, we have a strong sense of peoplehood as Palestinians. There are 15 million Palestinians around the world. The majority of them live in exile, away from their home, from their homes, from their cities, from their villages, from their towns. And despite that, we have a very powerful attachment to our country. So, and that's because it's not a connection that is just about, being from a territory. People in the US, for example, move from one place to another, from one city to another. It's an ongoing process. But there's something special about belonging to Palestine, the place. And Palestine, the place, informs a lot of our culture and heritage and who we are as people. So I will be talking about this tonight. I won't be addressing the myths that you read about. I hope to address these myths through this discussion. And of course, they will, I'm not just doing a training on how to respond to Zionist claims. A lot of people do that. We're also trying to understand, to proactively understand who we are, where we come from, and where we're headed as people. So yeah, next slide, please. Here is an opportunity for all of us to feel free to unmute in a minute and think, just take a few seconds to look at this map. This is a map without labels, without borders, without, any of the things that you see on any modern map. And this is satellite footage, right? So it's a satellite view of the region in which centers Palestine is located. And I just want to, take a couple of minutes to ask all of you, when you look at Palestine from above, surrounded by, in the midst of the surrounding, what are the first things that come to your mind in terms of the country and its history and the people who live there and their experiences? What does this map tell you? Lamia?
Yeah, I guess for me, when I think of like the history of Palestine and its like geographical location, what I think about is like the trade routes and how it's kind of at the center of like, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, and in a way it kind of connects all three continents together. But yeah.
Thank you so much. I think Fida, right? Or
Yes. I was just gonna say the first thing that came to my mind just looking at it was like the diversity of like I don't know if it's like the geography, but you have like desert in one area and then you have like trees and green in another area. So it just like makes me think about how beautiful and like diverse Palestine is with its like geography. So yeah, that was the first thing that came to my mind.
Thank you. Alston, do you mind elaborating more on the corner store? Corner store. That's thanks to my days in New York on the Cornerstone.
Just similar to what was said is, historically a lot of trade routes. I just think of it as kind of the cornerstone of that region between the Mediterranean, Africa, Middle East. A lot of history there. A lot of trade, a lot of people who have gone through that area during different eras in history.
Thank you so much. And Brian says that reminds him of how complicated the term Middle East is. And this is very important. I will talk about this in a second. Okay, Fida, your hand is still raised. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add. Okay.
No, I'm sorry, I forgot to lower it.
Oh, no worries.
Thank you.
No worries. So yes, this is the area that that is known today as Palestine and its contemporary borders is part of a broader region, and it has been inhabited since time immemorial. And it witnessed the succession of many civilizations that ruled over this part of the world. As you can see, it's located it connects two continents, but it's located in the middle between two regions that gave the world its greatest civilizations. If you look to the east, you could see the Euphrates River, Iraq, right? But also it's called as Mesopotamia. In Arabic, we call it Bilad ma bayna al-Nahrain, the country that lies between two rivers. So this was a place where a lot of civilizations emerged thanks to the abundance of fresh water, river water, and the ability of people to practice agriculture and be connected. And to Palestine's west, you could see the Nile Delta, and another place where another great civilization, the ancient Egyptian civilization, emerged and grew. So for thousands of years, this region, has been in the middle of a lot of action for people to cross from the Levant, which is the area where what is today Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria are located, and cross into Asia and then go into Africa. They had to go through Palestine. And what that meant, it meant that Palestine for a very long time has been a place that welcomed a lot of people. And of course, it had its original inhabitants, many, many years ago, but also those inhabitants were never they never lived in a vacuum, isolated from their surrounding and from an ever-changing world, a world that witnessed the rise of great civilizations, but also their decline, a world that went through times of economic prosperity, but also went through times of war and conquest and destruction and environmental disasters. So what that tells us about this part of the world is that it's a small territory, yes, the entire area of what is today historic Palestine, which includes what is the state of Israel and the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, is, I think, almost the same area of the state of New Jersey. But still, because of this, because of how busy Palestine's past has been, this is a place that has been inhabited for a very long time. Next slide, please. And this map here shows, like the importance of Palestine as a path for people traveling between three continents. I still question the impassable desert term. I just found this map. The next map I think will clarify why this impassable desert concept doesn't make sense. But So yeah, Palestine is a hub. It's a place through which people traveled and moved to and lived. Next slide, please. This is a map, for example, that shows one of the routes that that existed during the late Bronze Age, when most of Palestine was under ancient Egyptian control. So, for example, this route in red is called the Way of Horus, and it shows how connected Palestine was, for example, to Egypt. Next slide, please. And here's another map that shows how Palestine was connected to parts of the Arabian Peninsula. This is a map of trade routes that traders from all over the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula took to barter or sell or purchase all sorts of goods. I'm sure for those of us who are Muslim and are familiar with the Quran, there's a chapter in the Quran that talks about the journey of the winter and the journey of the summer, which were two trade journeys that the tribe of Quraysh, from which the Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, came, that they used to conduct every year. So they would go on a journey towards the Levant in the north, towards Gaza and Damascus, and they would go on a trade journey towards Yemen. And this is important here because, for example, when we talk about Palestine's Islamic and Arab identity, it goes back to even pre-Islamic times, and I will talk about this in a little bit. So, for example, the city of Gaza is also known as the Gaza of Hashim or Ghazat Hashim, because according to different accounts, the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad died in the city of Gaza during one of those travel journeys, and he was buried there, and there's a tomb named after him in the middle of the city of Gaza today. So Palestine was never in a vacuum. It was a place that was connected to these different cultures and civilizations that surrounded it through economic exchange, through conquest and invasion. It's a rich country with a very rich history. Next slide, please. This timeline, which I found online, and I found to be very interesting, describes the timeline of the city of Jerusalem, for example, one of Palestine's most important cities, and a city that Palestinians consider their capital. And just, think about, I would like for you to stop for a second and contemplate this timeline here, and just think about what this means, right? So 0, this is the year the Common Era begins, right? The birth of Christ. So from 2,000 years before the Common Era and until today, look at how many different civilizations and cultures and empires and states ruled over this city, Jerusalem, and what applies to Jerusalem here doesn't necessarily apply to other parts of Palestine, but this gives an idea about the kind of evolution and change in Palestine's history. And I think one of the things that one of the things that I think about when I look at the timeline like this is the idea that no single group could have the ability to say, we have an exclusive narrative, monopoly over this piece of land, because we had some sort of presence, God knows how many years ago. Instead, and this is what I'm going to talk about in a minute, when we think about Palestine, and when we think about the Palestinian culture, Palestinian heritage, Palestinian history, Palestinian folklore, Palestinian dialects, and I'm talking here about the Arabic-speaking people of Palestine who exist in the Palestinian homeland today or outside of it. Just a brief look at all of these aspects of their traditions and heritage and culture. A brief glimpse looking at all of these things can easily show that Palestinians, Arab Palestinians or Arabic-speaking Palestinians have inherited the entirety of these influences from these different civilizations and empires and cultures that existed in Palestine across millennia. I will explain this idea further in a minute, but another thing that is really important to keep in mind when we look at a timeline like this, 4,000-year history. The changes in who rules over a place doesn't necessarily mean that the people themselves vanish and disappear into thin air. And this is something very important that we need to understand about the people who inhabited the land known as Palestine for a very long time. Palestinians today inherit terms from, ancient Canaanite language. They also inherit certain notions that existed in, ancient Egyptian cultures. They also, and I will talk about this in a minute, up until the establishment of the State of Israel, they were also proud of Palestine's Jewish history and tradition. Palestinians inherited a lot of pagan rituals or notions or practices that they don't even think of as things that were passed from pre-monotheistic times. But I think the most important aspect of this timeline is the fact that around the time Palestine was incorporated into the Arab Islamic civilization, this civilization proved to be able to integrate the population of Palestine, and the population of Palestine accepted it. And this is very important. So when we think about, the Canaanite time, some Palestinians today say that they're the descendants of the Canaanite. Probably they are. I don't think that matters. But I think what matters is that in the past 1,500 years, the people of Palestine, their language has become the Arabic language, which a language that they embraced due to the spread of the Islamic civilization and them becoming part of that civilization, but also because Palestinians, big parts of them were Arabic speaking before Islam, even Christians. And I will talk about this briefly. And Palestine becomes part of this Arab Muslim world. And even though European crusaders tried to conquer Palestine You see the Kingdom of Jerusalem, those glimpses here in the medieval era. Those projects didn't succeed. And Palestine returned into the Arab Islamic civilization. Next slide, please. So I said all of these things, and I'm sorry if I went on a tangent, because I want to establish an important point tonight about what our narrative as Palestinians mean vis-a-vis the Zionist narrative. And it is important to think about the Palestinian narrative as a reflection, a representation of this rich, long history of uninterrupted residence of large numbers of people in this country that we call Palestine. As opposed to a narrative, can we go back to the timeline, please? As opposed to a narrative that says, well, some 3,000 or 2,000 years ago, there was this brief presence of some form of Hebrew/Israelite sovereignty in this land. Therefore, today, 2,000 years later, that gives a group the right to claim an exclusive control and narrative over this land and impose certain symbols, certain, certain language and a certain culture, and disregard the history before and the history after. This is where the problem is today. Can we go back to the next slide? So for me, when I think about the Palestinian narrative, about who we are and where we come from, I don't think some Palestinians like to say, we are the descendants of the Canaanites. Okay, like I said earlier, sure, you could be a descendant of the Canaanites, but it doesn't matter because this country has been part of all these transformations that happened around it, organically or by force or because of, a changing world. And the people who lived in this place, who are my ancestors and the ancestors of many of the people on this call tonight, they have adapted and changed and embraced certain cultures and filtered them and disregarded certain things that came from the outside. But what really matters about this narrative is that we are a people who lived on this land for a very long time and continue living on this land. And I will show certain aspects of how the Palestinian narrative reflects continuity in the land. Next slide, please. So I wanted to, before I get to that, this is like the main point of the entire presentation tonight. The Palestinian narrative is built on the idea of being native to the land, and it includes what does being native to the land means. It includes the collective experiences and knowledge passed down through generations of Palestinians, and it takes into account the continuous and disruptive events that have shaped Palestinian history, identity, faith, culture, economy, and dialects. And I will give some examples in what follows about what this means. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So for example, this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites for Christians around the world. And of course, it's a place that Christian Palestinians hold dearly. I just would like for you to look at the dome for a second before we move into the next slide. This church was built during the Roman Byzantine era, when Roman Byzantines ruled Palestine. And I'm sure you know a few things about, or a lot of things probably about the Roman Byzantine Empire, which was which was a continuation of the Roman Empire that accepted Christianity and adopted it as a state religion. So, and of course, Palestine is the birthplace of Christianity, and the Roman Byzantines honored Palestine's Christian history. That said, there were in Palestine native Palestinians who were either Aramaic speaking or who spoke early forms of Arabic and saw themselves as citizens and people who belonged to that empire that ruled. However, next slide, please. And I know this picture will be a little bit shocking for most of you. When Palestine becomes incorporated into the Arab Islamic civilization, and Muslims enter Jerusalem and start building and honoring religious sites that they considered important for monotheism in the city of Jerusalem. The architectural style in building and in constructing mosques and monuments derives from those early forms that existed in, say, the Christian era and the pre-Christian era. The Dome of the Rock did not have a golden dome up until the 1960s. In the 1960s, King Hussein of Jordan launched a project to change the way the dome looked. And of course, this photo is from the 1950s. Palestine was, just recovering from a Nakba, from which, we never recovered. So you could see that the Aqsa Mosque was not in the best shape possible. But the color, even if you look at the Aqsa Mosque, which is like the main Aqsa Mosque, which is located inside the compound, the color of its dome is the same color that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, if we can go back to the previous slide, has. So the Dome of the Rock, a building that was built during the Umayyad era, the Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled over Palestine throughout the 7th century. They derived from architectural styles that existed in previous eras. Can we go to the next slide and the following one, please? This mosaic was discovered in Gaza just a few months ago. A farmer discovered this mosaic in the backyard of his house. And this mosaic belongs to the Roman era. Next slide, please. But if you go to the Palace of Hisham, which is a palace that was built in Jericho in the 7th century as well, you would find mosaic that follows the same style of highlighting animals and plants that are native to the region. And yes, lions were native to the region, and they only disappeared after the Suez Canal was dug in the 19th century because they couldn't cross anymore through the desert from Africa, and because, of course, of centuries of hunting. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just looking at the way mosques and churches are built, for example, there isn't much difference in the way these structures are built and designed. This is the Katib Wilaya Mosque in Gaza City, which is located next to the Church of Saint Porphyrius, and also in Gaza City. The church was built in 325 AD, and the mosque was built 600 years later. So think about the time gap, but also think about the continuity. Some people in Gaza remained Christian after Palestine became Arab and Islamic and Muslim. Others converted to Islam. Those who converted to Islam, or the Muslims who moved into the city of Gaza, they adopted the same architectural styles and building and design that existed before. This is continuity. Can we move to the next slide, please? Another aspect of shared culture between the people who live in this land is their dress. This is a map of the Palestinian thobe, which when we all heard about when Representative Tlaib wore it in Congress, but we're familiar with, of course, as Palestinians, because our mothers, grandmothers, aunts wear it. And if you look at the map, what's really fascinating here is that there are different variations to the same concept of this dress that people wear. And what's also more fascinating is that the thobe does not stop within the boundaries of what is today modern Palestine, right? There are communities in Jordan, southern Syria, southern Lebanon, the eastern parts of the Sinai, that you could find how this thobe has been different variations of it, correspond to the main design, the main way people have made this dress that women wear in Palestine. Next slide, please. And another important aspect of the cultural and religious continuity in Palestine, despite changes in what religion people follow or what faith they subscribe to, where also a number of religious or faith-based festivals that were very big in Palestine before 1948, and unfortunately a lot of them disappeared after 48, and I will explain why. This was a religious holiday, a religious festival that Palestinians called Mawsim al-Nabi Musa, or the festival of Prophet Moses. And this was a religious festival that was mainly celebrated by Palestinian Muslims and Christians. It was a national holiday, even before modern nationalism and before, so during the Ottoman era and for hundreds of years before, you have Palestinian Muslims and Christians celebrating an annual holiday known as the holiday of Prophet Moses. And those were not Jewish people. They did not subscribe to Judaism, did not follow the Jewish faith. But for them, they consider Prophet Moses as a symbol of monotheism, but also as a figure whose history is linked and whose legacy is linked to the land. So every year, Palestinians would do local pilgrimage from all over cities and villages of Palestine, and they would travel to the tomb of Prophet Moses. No one knows whether Prophet Moses was buried there or not, but they would do this holiday. And what is ironic and interesting is that the Prophet Moses festival becomes a catalyst for anti-Zionist rebellion during the British Mandate era. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here is another festival. Luckily, we have video footage, which was called the Festival of Nabi Robin, or the Prophet Robin Festival. In the Islamic tradition, we don't know of a prophet named Robin. Palestinian historians have disputed the origins of the name. Anyway, here's another festival that used to take place by the Mediterranean, and I just want to show some footage. Sadly, there is no sound, so just make sure to read the captions. So you see people traveling and bringing the logistics of, and of course, you know, in Arabs, full-blown Bedouins, this is like, can get more British. Which grows like magic in the desert. Anyway, just so they construct this entire city on the beach near Jaffa, and people come from every part of Palestine to celebrate this festival. People would congregate, there will be food, music. You could see the old school fairs and markets flourish, shops, restaurants, and side stalls spring up overnight to administer the needs of 20 to 30,000 pilgrims and visitors here. And these are all local pilgrims and visitors, even on a regional basis. So probably someone from the Galilee wouldn't necessarily come to this, but definitely people from Lid, Gaza, Ramallah. This is fool in the making. Hummus, which, you know, is now disputed, is a disputed dish. Making bread. This definitely wasn't an empty land. But I will talk about the concept of an empty land shortly. And this is making me hungry. Pay attention to this description. And we're talking here about Palestinian Muslims. Thank you, Abir. Next slide, please. And before I get to this quote, so this is, in short, these festivals, they reflect, you know, how Palestinians, directly or indirectly, consciously or subconsciously, they view themselves as the inheritors of the aggregate of cultures and faiths and legacies that had to do with their country. This is an important passage from a book written by Noor Masalha, a very important Palestinian historian. The book is entitled Palestine, a 4,000-Year History, and I highly recommend reading this book. It's also available on Audible for those of you who like to listen to books. And I will read the passage, but also I'll talk a little bit about it. And this is a question for, of course, the answer is spoiled here, but you know, every summer when our parents or aunts or uncles plan a trip to Palestine, they say, إحنا رايحين على blank. Abir is nodding. إحنا رايحين على البلاد. I will read the passage. The Palestinian people experience their country of Palestine individually and collectively. Although Zionist settler colonialism violated their indigenous right to self-determination in their historical homeland, and they live either under settler colonial occupation or exiled and rarely allowed to speak for themselves, they continue to speak of Biladuna Palestine, our country, Palestine. Vernacularly, Baladna Palestine, or Filistinuna, our Palestine. Even Palestinian citizens of Israel often speak of al-Balad or Baladna, our country, as a patriotic way of mentally or representationally avoiding the term Israel, and connecting with historic Palestine and the Palestinian people as a whole. The term Bilad or Biladuna are medieval Arabic terms which have been in common use for many centuries and are deeply rooted in people's daily lives. In the second half of the 19th century, the medieval Arabic term Watan, homeland, was impacted by the European term Patria, and Watan became more closely associated with the rise of modern forms of patriotic homeland nationalism, aka Wataniya, in Palestine and throughout the Arab world. So what Masalha is saying here is that before there was a modern consciousness of Palestine as a modern nation state within specified borders, the people who lived in Palestine viewed it as a country, as a region, that where the people who live there are Palestinian. The people who come from there were Palestinian. And I will elaborate more, next slide, please. Because if you look at classical texts by historians or, you know, people who narrate the hadith, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad from throughout Arab, you know, like Islamic history. And I will translate all of this now. You will find this awareness that exists very in a very elaborate way, in a very clear way. So, for example, the first line in Arabic, it's a book that was written in the third century, the third Hijri century. So we're talking 1100 years ago. The author says this is a history book about the succession of nations. Okay, he says وأهل جند فلسطين أخلاط من العرب والعجم ومن لخم وجذام وعاملة وكندة وقيس وكنانة. He says that Jund Philistine, or what was known as the military territory of Palestine during the early time of the Islamic conquest, the people who live there are mixes from Arabs and non-Arabs and from tribes like Lukhum and Judham and Amila and Kinda and Qais and Kinana. Those were the names of very old Arab tribes. Okay, so the second line talks about the son of one of the companions of Prophet Muhammad who lived in Palestine. And this book is also from more than 1,000 years ago. The line says in Arabic, وعبد الله ابن عمرو بن العاص مات بعجلان قرية من قرى الشام بالقرب من غزة من أرض فلسطين. So he's talking about a guy named Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, who was the son of the Prophet's companion. And he says that this guy, Abdullah, died in a town called Ajlan. And now pay attention to how he describes Ajlan. He says, a village from the villages of the Levant, near Gaza, in the land of Palestine. This is from 1,000 years ago. The last line. This is a lexicon of what in Arabic is called ansab, or like, you know, family lineage. So he's talking here, he's describing a family name, the family name Ar-Ramli. And then he says in Arabic, Ar-Ramli بفتح الراء وسكون الميم واللام منسوب إلى الرملة وهي مدينة من أرض فلسطين قريبا من عسقلان. So he's talking about the family of Ar-Ramli. This is from 800 years ago. So he says Ar-Ramli, which originates in Ramla, and it's a city from the land of Palestine close to Asqalan, a coastal city in Palestine. So this awareness existed. People called this land Palestine. They were aware of its distinct territorial identity, while it was incorporated in these bigger, you know, ever-changing empires, caliphates, sultanates, and so on and so forth. Next, please. Now, let's take a break from Palestine and the Palestinians and take a look at what was happening in Europe during the late 19th, early 20th century. I'm not going to dwell on this for a very long time, but this is an important context. I'll say a few things. There was a Jewish question in Europe. Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century posed what Europe called a Jewish question, meaning Europeans during the height of, the beginning of nationalism and during the era of colonialism and imperialism, they were asking themselves, what do we do with our Jewish population? Will Jews in Europe become citizens? Are they equal? Do they belong in Europe? And unfortunately, we know the answer. There was a lot of racism and there was a lot of rejection of Jewish assimilation in Western European countries like France and Germany. And of course, there was organized systemic oppression of Jews in Eastern Europe and under the Russian Empire. The response of these Jewish communities was to either stay and fight or migrate to lands of opportunity like Canada, the US. You can see the numbers. But a smaller number of Jews from Europe, as the Vox video from earlier said, they decided that one of the solutions to face the predicament facing Jews in Europe was to create a national homeland, a state for Jews in Palestine, and ask and call upon Jews all over the world to return to Palestine. And here is the conundrum. The Zionist movement says that Jews have the right to revive their national existence in Palestine because they had this 2,000-year-old, 3,000-year-old connection to the land. And Palestinians do not deny that. And as I showed earlier, Palestinians, in fact, embrace the Muslim heritage of the land, the Christian heritage of the land, the Jewish heritage of the land, the pre-monotheistic heritage of the land. They were celebrating Nabi Musa and Nabi Rubin and Prophet Solomon in Gaza and all of these things. What Palestinians said, though, is that, hold on a second, are you saying that from the moment this ancient Jewish sovereign presence ceased in Palestine until today, everything was relevant, everything didn't matter? The people who lived in this land and built their connection and built the land and built the Church of Holy Sepulchre and the Dome of the Rock and wear the thobe and do these festivals and are connected through, blood relations and economic ties and cultural ties and have their dialects and live in these villages and are familiar with the country. None of this matters. So our issue was not that, Jews wanted to come to our country. Palestine was open to people from all ethnicities and nationalities. There were all sorts of people living in Palestine in the late 19th century, late 20th century. Our problem as Palestinians was with the fact that this was a project that was saying that the only narrative, the only story that matters is one story, one narrative. Next slide, please. Colonialism arrives, I'm not going to dwell on that. British and French arrive in a region, they destroy it. Next slide. So they divide up the region. And then comes the Balfour Declaration. And I really want you to, in light of everything that I said, to contemplate the text of this declaration, because when Palestine falls under British rule and the British, want to give Palestine to the Zionist movement, here's what they say. This is Balfour, Lord Balfour. He was the British foreign minister during World War I. British forces just occupied Palestine. This is late October, early November 1917. Britain just took Palestine from the Ottomans. And Lord Balfour sends the message to Lord Rothschild, who he asked to pass the letter to Zionist organizations. And he basically says, I have much pleasure, blah, blah, blah. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Anybody who would read this would be like, oh, wow, you know, the British were so inclusive. They were about like equality and justice. But if you were Palestinian in 1917 and read this, and you come from people who are the inheritors of everything that I talked about, and even more, and you read this declaration, which you would have a moral and a political and a legal issue with, because British does not own Palestine to begin with, to give it to the Zionist movement. But put all of this aside, for you to see that you are called, you're described in an official document that will be very important for the future of your country and for shaping policy and shaping privilege and shaping who gets what at the expense of whom. To see yourself described by what you are not, and not but who you are. He's basically saying, he's describing Palestinians, who were at that moment 93% of the population, as non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And a few months later, when he was asked about this project to establish this national home in Palestine, he basically said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing Balfour, he said that the hopes and aspirations and complaints of more than 700,000 Arabs in Palestine do not really matter. Zionism is a project that is rooted in an age-old, beautiful idea, and in future and in present concerns and in future hopes. If this wasn't racism, if this wasn't dehumanization, what is this then? Next slide, please. Of course, you know, and this is for us, you know, maybe we'll talk about tonight or later. This is for an example of one of the books by Jewish scholars around the time of the Balfour Declaration, like 2 years after the Balfour Declaration was published. Morris Jastrow, he was a scholar in the Bible in the University of Pennsylvania, and he wrote this book, basically like, you know, arguing against Zionism. And this is very important also to establish here, which is to say that Zionism and its project was not a matter of consensus even within Jewish communities worldwide. Jews did not agree that Zionism was the answer. Of course, Zionism succeeds later because of the way it allied itself with imperial powers, and the way it of course, the Zionists were smart. You know, you could still say that your enemy is smart. So, but we can talk about this later. And I would like to end. I know we're running out of time, right? Abir, how much time do we have left?
We have about 45 minutes left.
Oh, okay. But I really want to open it for discussion soon. If we could like move to the next slide, please. This book is, and I rarely do that, but you know, because I really like think it's really important for tonight's topic. So my academic research is on pre-1948 Palestinian writings on Zionism. And this, what you see in front of you now is a rare book, rare because, you know, we don't have it in every library anymore, but it exists. It's a book that was published in New York City in 1919 by a group of Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese activists and scholars who in 1919 formed a group called the Palestine Anti-Zionism Society in New York City. For those of you in New Jersey, right across the Hudson. And there was a thriving Syrian community in New York City. There's a rich history for that you could learn about. New York had a little Syria, which unfortunately was demolished during city expansion and urban transformation, and then was relocated to what is now downtown Brooklyn. So if you go to downtown Brooklyn, where Yemen Cafe is, and you find these like Syrian stores, these are traces of what used to be a thriving, large Little Syria community in New York City. And New York City's Little Syria was home to people who were part of that community, but also Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese who would come from, the Ottoman Empire and later from these countries under colonialism and study in the US and learn and build a career, probably go back. This book in front of you was published in 1919 in New York City by the Syrian American Press. It was an anthology, a collection of essays by a group of Palestinian, Syrian and Lebanese writers who talked about Palestine. In Arabic, the book translates into فلسطين وتجديد حياتها, Palestine and renewing its life, a comprehensive book about historical, urban, social, political subjects related to Palestine. It was edited by Hanna Salah from Ramallah, who studied at the American University in Beirut and then at Harvard, and who worked with the group of people who wrote this book. The book is divided into two parts. The first part deals with present issues in Palestine following the end of the First World War. How do we revive the country's economy and infrastructure and health? Victoria Tannous, a Palestinian woman, she wrote a chapter about women in Palestine and the need for them to receive more education and participate in the public and political life. Dr. Fuad Shatara, who was based in New York, he was Palestinian. He wrote a chapter about health and hygiene after the war in Palestine, and he called for Palestine, establishing better hospitals and improving the healthcare system. Others wrote about tourism and about trade and about education, and what the future of Palestine once it becomes independent will look like. So they had a whole vision, a complete vision of Palestine. The second part of the book deals with Zionism. So those Palestinian authors and writers, they were aware of Zionism, and they knew they understood what at that moment they were dealing with. Contrary to a lot of arguments that Palestinian response came later, and Palestinians weren't really aware of what was happening. And I'm writing, this book is one of the main things that I'm focusing on in my dissertation, and soon there will be a comprehensive analysis of every word in it, hopefully when I turn my dissertation into a book. But next slide, please. I wanted to highlight this, this paragraph from the book, which I think is very important today. And it shows the ability of Palestinian intellectuals. The writer of this chapter is from Syria, his name was Habib Katiba from the city of Yabrud, outside of Damascus. He cared for Palestine. He wrote a lot about Palestine. He died young in the late 40s. I'm going to read the passage in Arabic and then translate it to English. إذ يستحيل على المسلم أو المسيحي بحكم ذاتيته أن يكون صهيونيا، فتصبح معاملة الصهيونيين للأهالين الفلسطينيين كمعاملة الأمم لليهود. فإن صح ذلك صح اضطهاد اليهود الاجتماعي في أوروبا لسبب عينه. ثم إنه رغم وجود رجال أحرار كثيرين بين الصهيونيين فإن الأغلب بينهم من المتعصبين في الدين والرجعيين، فالحركة الصهيونية تمكن في هؤلاء النزعة الدينية وتهدد الأمة اليهودية بصبغتهم من غير محمودة. Okay, I'll translate it. So this paragraph is part of the, the author is basically saying, what if Zionism succeeds? What will be the implications? If Zionism succeeds in creating a state in Palestine and rule over Palestinians. So he says, if Zionism succeeds, it would become impossible for Muslims or Christians, due to their identities, to be Zionist. Because Muslims can't be Zionist, Christians can't be Zionists. This is an exclusivist project. And as a result, the Zionists will treat the Palestinian inhabitants the same way European nations treat Jews. This is 1919, everyone. So if this was acceptable in Palestine, then by extension, it would be acceptable that European nations oppress Jews, which the author doesn't agree with. And then he goes on and says, and despite that there are a lot of free men, remember this is 1919, amongst the Zionists. So he says that there are decent people in the Zionist movement, like Ahad Ha'am, for example. But the majority amongst them are fanatics in religion and are reactionaries, because the Zionist movement enables in these people a religious impulse and threaten the Jewish nation with an unpleasant outlook. Now, some of you would ask if Palestinians knew, if they understood why nothing happened. Why couldn't they? And this is a conversation for later. We could talk about resistance. We could talk about translating these ideas into action, and Palestinians resisted. This book was written in the context of the Peace Conference in Paris, which was organized after the end of World War I. And it was a conference that was meant to basically reconfigure the world after the war. And those Palestinians wrote this book, translated big parts of it into European languages, and they sent petitions and letters to the big powers that were meeting in the peace conference. Unfortunately, the British did not listen to them. Next slide, please. So here we are. Palestine is now under the British mandate, and we have the most powerful empire in the world, the British Empire, committed to enabling and promoting the interests of the Zionist movement. A lot has been written about what went into that and how that happened economically, politically, in terms of, how the British enabled the Zionists and provided them with the means necessary to be able to build their power and transform the country. But despite that, even under the mandate, this was still a connected country. This was still a connected nation. You could take the train from Gaza to Haifa, could travel, go anywhere you want. So even under the British mandate, Palestine as a geographic space inhabited by people who see themselves as one people, it was still connected. Next slide, please. Now, this this changes in an unprecedented way during the Nakba, the 1948 Nakba, which was a major disruption, an unprecedented one. Think about everything that I said about Palestine and its 4,000-year history, and about the experiences of the people who were able to pass, to experience continuity and rupture and ever-changing cultures and civilizations that ruled over their country. But under none of these conditions, historically, Palestinians experienced a process of uprooting from their land that continued for 7 decades and still continues. What happened in 1948, the Nakba, was unprecedented in Palestinian history. Completely unprecedented. Even during World War I, when the British and the Ottomans were fighting on Palestinian land, and the Ottomans were defending Palestine from the British, and entire Palestinian cities like Gaza were completely decimated, people were able to return and rebuild. They were able to rebuild their cities and villages and towns and move on with their lives. The Zionist movement, though, from its inception, with ideas like a land without a people. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this line, right? You know, like they say, we hear it a lot in speeches, especially by, you know, enthusiastic uncles during fundraisers. They say it's a land without a people. But think about the saying. It's not that they claimed that it was an empty land, or that there were no people. They were there. They saw the people there. They saw Palestinians. They bought from them, you know, stayed in their hotels and purchased their produce and hired them as workers and whatever. But when they say without a people who are worthy of nationhood, without a people who are worthy of self-determination, without a people who have a valuable culture and a valuable roots and a valuable connection to this land. So the Nakba, before it was realized in the form of mass expulsion from towns and villages and cities, the Nakba was an idea that was brewing in the Zionist mindset. That in order for this Jewish majority state to be realized, you have to get rid of Palestinians. They need to leave. And their connection to the land and their culture and heritage, none of these things matter. Next slide, please. And this is why, you know, they say that in 1948, you know, it was a state of war and Israel had no option. But Israel was satisfied with the outcomes of the 1948 war, you know, like turning the majority of Palestinians into refugees. And that's why one of the first things that Israel did after its establishment was to pass the absentees property law. And it was a law that basically defined people who were forced, expelled from their property, from their towns, from their cities, from their villages, considered them absentee. It's as if they, you know, chose to be absent and seized their land and their property and their homes and their jewelry and their bank accounts. Next slide, please. And then Israel says, you know, if only Palestinians accepted the partition plan in 1947, which was a total, you know, meaningless plan, But here, for example, you have Israel's attitude after 1948 showed nothing but the impulse and the desire for more expansion. For example, in 1956, Israel occupies Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. And in 1956, Israel reopens Gaza's post office and issues this postcard. This postcard was issued by the Israeli state. And the Israeli state that claims that it accepted partition says that Gaza is and always shall be Israel. Gaza was part of the Palestine Mandate and was unlawfully taken from Israel by Egypt. So much for accepting partition, right? Next slide, please. And then in 1967, Israel reconquers the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, occupies the Golan Heights from Syria, and occupies the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And in 1970, they issue this map that shows Israel and its post-67 borders, including the Sinai Peninsula. And I wonder if Egyptians didn't fight in 1973, what would have happened to the Sinai? It probably would have had the same fate as the Golan Heights. Next slide, please. So I will stop here and then we'll open it for discussion because I really want to hear from you all. This process. So I basically talked about two things tonight. Number one, the positive part of the presentation, that we Palestinians are a people whose existence means something. It's not just a flag and an olive tree and a line dance and a thope. These things are important, but they mean something. They have deeper meanings in terms of the continuity of our existence in the land and our relationship and connection with it, and how this continuity represents our roots in that place. The negative part, or I could describe as the buzzkill part of the presentation, was about a settler colonial project that came and said, there is one story that matters, one narrative that matters, and one group of people that matter. And that's basically, in my opinion, why we have these maps in front of our eyes right now. It is a process of erasure, and it's a process that is the result of dealing with a settler colonial project that denies our existence, denies our peoplehood, denies our culture, denies our connection to the land, denies who we are, denies where we come from, denies us a future too. And they have made it mutually exclusive the moment they decided that none of these things matter. And every aspect of this project's continuation today is rooted in this notion that one people matter, one narrative matters, one story matters, and the rest doesn't matter. That's why the Nakba happened, and that's why the Nakba continues. And that's why they have launched successive conquests. And that's why they are going to unleash way more harsher policies in the future. And that's why this project needs to be challenged and stopped. And that's why we have to work and continue working, because this is an existential issue. So I will stop here. and I would open it for questions بعد إذن يعني our hosts. And yeah, I'm really curious to hear from you because I've been talking for a very long time, so I think it's about time for me to pause for a second. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Jihad. That was really great. I wrote a lot. I think the way you helped like articulate a lot of themes that like I've been familiar with, and I'm sure a lot of us have been familiar with, but in a way to help us contextualize the historical time period is really great. I also really appreciate how you centered Palestine and Palestinians throughout all of it, which is something that we've been trying to do a lot more of in this course. So thank you for modeling that very well. Yeah, we have 25 minutes for open discussion. So I know there was a lot of information. We need some time to process, or use this time to process together, because that's sometimes a lot easier. So feel free to just, I want to say unmute, but if that gets too messy, you just raise hands and we'll call on people. Questions, reflections, thoughts, things that were confusing. We're just going to open it up.
I'm also open for criticism and objections and corrections.
Brian, go ahead.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the presentation. It was really, really great. I had a question about the identification with the Canaanites. As an outsider to this, has that increased post 48 because there's more of a perceived need to counter the claim of Jewish indigeneity?
Should we take multiple questions at a time or just answer?
I think we should just answer it.
Okay. Brian, my pleasure, of course. Thank you so much for the question. So the answer is yes and no. And it's complicated because Palestinian Muslims and Christians before 1948, when they think about the history of the country and the history of the land, there is something that we call sacred history, which is history inspired by biblical or Quranic or Quranic accounts of history. And historians in general, before 1948, when they, like Arif al-Arif, who was like a historian who wrote like a history of Gaza and history of Jerusalem and history of Bir al-Saba', or Uthman al-Tabba', who wrote history of Gaza. For them, they take sacred history for granted. They don't question it because, remember, these people some of them were secular, but they also they underwent religious education. And so there wasn't a crisis between secular and sacred histories. And for them, Palestine was the land of the Bible. There were Jews here, there were Christians here, then Muslims came. So they were at peace with these things that now appear to be mutually exclusive. What Zionism did was that it made it really difficult for people to embrace, to proactively embrace or talk about this history. Although, of course, like Muslims today, they say, they consider themselves the true inheritors of monotheism, and they consider, Jewish prophets to be true monotheists. So there's like a religious interpretation question here. So for Muslims, there's the idea that Islam is the true continuity of true monotheism as it was embraced by Jewish prophets in ancient times. But let's put this aside now. So there's this like issue with the sacred history. And of course, yes, you have a project that says we belong to a people who existed in this country 2,000 years ago. So Palestinians would say, but we belong to people who existed in this land 4,000 years ago. And lately, there have been a lot of excavations in burial sites in cities like Asqalan or in Sidon in Lebanon. And, scientists have been doing a lot of comparison between the DNA of people who lived in the Bronze Age, who lived in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, 3,000 or even 4,000 years ago, and they compared with the DNA of contemporary residents of the country, and they're able to show that there is continuity. I personally, I don't like this DNA business. For me, it's an uncomfortable territory because it opens the door for eugenics and for talk of purity and whatnot. I lean more towards embracing the diversity and richness of the country, and the fact that this was not an island that was isolated from its surrounding. People moved to Palestine in search of opportunity, in search of spirituality. People left Palestine. Palestine was a place like any other place in the world that that witnessed movement of people in and out of it for a variety of reasons. What matters though is that the people who inhabit Palestine, who live in Palestine, that they have a unique culture, a valuable connection to the land that has been undermined by a political project empowered by powerful states around the world. So this is the question here. This is the issue for me as a Palestinian. It's about denying my human rights because there is a project that claims exclusivity based on a biblical account or an archaeological interpretation or a historical interpretation of, and making a certain episode of the country's long history the superior one and everything else secondary. So here's where my problem is with this whole idea. I don't do these DNA tests for privacy and safety reasons. But if I do the DNA test and I find out that 4,000 years ago, my ancestors lived in Deir al-Balah, where my family is from, or if I find out that my family moved to Deir al-Balah in the 18th century because one of my ancient ancestors or was with a military that passed or was part of a trade convoy that passed through and he decided to stay. In either cases, that does not say anything about the right of my family that was in Palestine around the time Zionism came and said these people are irrelevant, they don't matter. That doesn't deprive them of the right to have human rights. And that doesn't make them less Palestinians than Palestinians who can claim a Canaanite ancestry. And that doesn't, make it. So again, like you get the idea. This is more about the rights of living people than about claiming ancestry, and it's about what kind of vision do we have for life in this place? Is it a vision rooted in obsession over things that happened thousands of years ago at the expense of the safety and sanity and well-being of people today? And that happens in the context of, like biblical excavation sometimes, in parts of Jerusalem, for example, when you have Christian evangelical organizations or Zionist organizations trying to destroy entire Palestinian neighborhoods because that the place where they live matters to reinforce a certain aspect of the Zionist narrative about the land or the religious narrative about the land. So what happens here is that you have living people, human beings, becoming secondary to these ideas. And that's dangerous. That's really dangerous. And these are precedents that should not be tolerated. Of course, unfortunately, they are tolerated in the context of Palestine. But, you know, that's why we need to stop them. Sorry for the long answer. And I hope I answered the question.
Thanks, Brian.
Yes, thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? We have time for maybe one or two more. And it could just be comments, it could be things you found interesting. I think we can use this space to unpack a lot of what we just heard and talked about. Rania, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I was waiting because I wanted to see if anyone else wanted to say something. But thank you, Jihad. I think that was very, very informative. And I really enjoyed how, you connected all the different points and talking about the two different levels. And I think I was texting Abir while we were doing the presentation. I feel like it tied really well with our presentation last week, since we highlighted and spoke a lot about the culture. And we kept emphasizing that this is something that's been done for generations and the significance of it. And it's not just taken at face value. So I think that's really important. And then the second part, which I also think is very important, specifically in our time, and this is my question, is that there's like a increasing discussion about the history and refuting the history, especially from the Israeli side. I recently heard that even Benjamin Netanyahu is now saying that Palestine is a settler colonialist project against Israel, which is completely turning the narrative around, and literally boils my blood. But I think your whole presentation kind of refutes that. But if you were to give everyone, I guess, a summary response as to how that is an absolutely ridiculous claim, and how to best respond to that, because I think that's what's crazy now is it's not only, at first they were saying that Israel, they're the original Jews were the original inhabitants of the land. Now it's like they're going to a different level of arguing against the history. So if you can speak a little bit about that.
Of course, I mean, sometimes there are levels of stupidity that no matter how intelligent you are, you can't just engage with. And I think Netanyahu and people who follow his project, they're past that phase where they try to act somewhat rationally and try to reflect an image of mental stability, and show that they're repeating all this nonsense. And in certain situations, when you're and here's what before I of course we could always provide all sorts of answers for these arguments, but I think engaging with these ideas relies on the context and relies on who you're talking to. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where our opposition bring up these stupid ideas, in my opinion, to deflect from talking about issues that are rooted in a sense of urgency, like bombing of Gaza, or just evacuating for expelling people from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, or building a settlement, or arresting children in the middle of the night, zip cuff, blindfold, drag them into military detention where they would stay under administrative detention for indefinitely. So and these arguments happen a lot in university contexts, in town halls, in BDS debates, things like that. And so it's important to pay attention to whether this is talked about in good faith or bad faith from our opposition. We could have conversations with Zionists who are on the fence, who are not sure. Sorry, Rodney.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, because I agree with you 100%. There's some crazy stuff that you just completely dismissed. But I think what I'm referencing, and I know he he didn't make this claim in this interview, but like, for example, Jordan Peterson, who's a psychologist who's raising in fame, right? Like there was a recent interview with him and Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And it's also like that concept where a lot of people are following him and listening to him. And it's basically like an uninterrupted version of Benjamin Netanyahu's history, right? Going of Israel and of the establishment of the Israeli state, going to the ears of all of the followers of, so I think that's it, is kind of challenging, I guess, aside from what you can actually say, it's also challenging in having Palestinians in these areas and in these seats. Like, I'm really happy to hear, I actually never formally heard about your PhD, so I love what you're doing, and I think it's really important. And I think we need more of that. Like, we need more of that. We need more people sharing this. Like, what you're saying now shouldn't just be shared in our classroom. Like, I feel like it needs to be shouted and like to the world. Yeah.
I mean, part of our Nakba is that we lost the Palestinian library before 48. And what is also ironic, I really recommend a documentary called The Great Book Robbery, which is about books that Zionists stole from people's homes in 1948 and are stored in the bunker of the Israel National Library. That's it. That's a documentary. So, as a researcher, I only found these books in public libraries in New York, in the Library of Congress. And I found them by coincidence. So, like I can't access, we can't access our intellectual production, our knowledge production as Palestinians. Now, if I were to be invited to an interview with Jordan Peterson, which I don't think will ever happen, I don't go on Twitter complaining about wokeness and complaining about men having no space to be men. Of course, I would say, that first of all, colonialism was a self-evident notion that the Zionist movement embraced in its inception. They established quote-unquote colonial funds, and they saw themselves as a colonial project. If they want to rewrite history, they can be our guests, but unfortunately, these are things that are proved and written about even by Zionism, but Zionists themselves and Israeli historians and scholars. Now, on the issue of Arabs colonizing Palestine from Jews, I mean, this is a big topic, and they, the problem for me as a serious academic is that how do I respond to these buzzwords that are thrown like this with nuance that requires the ability to refute these things calmly and with evidence? And Arabs existed in Palestine, in Jordan, in Syria, and Lebanon for a very long time, and even when, and there's also the question of the historicity of the Bible, right? Like the ancient Hebrew / Israelite / Jewish presence in Palestine is talked about in ways that today that abuse modern understandings of how states and kingdoms exist and operate, and project a modern understanding of this type of presence onto an ancient presence that happened 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So, for example, the Bible talks about these glorious kingdoms, Hebrew Israelite kingdoms that exist in Palestine. But secular Israeli historians, they question the scale of these kingdoms. They view them as mini city-states that existed alongside other mini city-states inhabited by other Semitic people, some of whom were pagan, others were, so we can get into all of that, right? And we can also talk about how the Arabness and Arab identity and the Arabic language evolved out of its Semitic, cultural, and social and political predecessors. So, for example, in today's Palestinian dialect, you find words that you can trace to Canaanite, and you can trace to Hebrew, and you can trace to ancient Egyptian languages, and you can trace back to Greek, and you can trace back to Latin. And so in terms of the development, the evolution of the Arab dialect, the Arabic Palestinian dialect, it's a local product based on integration with the surrounding, but also it has its people there integrated with this Arab Islamic civilization that organically emerged in the region and continues to exist and became the culture of the land, the language of the land, and you know, like the hegemonic, and of course, you know, we recognize that there are also other minorities and people from different backgrounds who speak other languages, but we're talking here about what is shared amongst a large number of people. And we Palestinians happen to identify as Arab and as Palestinian. The majority of us are Muslim, but there's a large number of Christian Palestinians. So, and also, like, there's this tendency to rewrite Jewish history, right? Like the idea that, you know, like Jews existed in Palestine and then they were coerced overnight to leave, and then 2,000 years later they return. This isn't serious history, because yes, there were Jewish presence in Palestine. It ceased due to all sorts of economic, social, political factors, but it didn't happen in the dramatic way Zionists like Netanyahu describe it. It happened as part of processes of people moving to other parts of the world, seeking opportunities somewhere else. And of course, you know, I can recommend a lot of readings about this topic. And finally, you know, and this is what Palestinian legal scholars argued in the early 20th century. They say, okay, well, if it, you know, the right of conquest was accepted by nations for a very long time, until the early 20th century, and until actually the Second World War, after which there was an effort to condemn and deny the right of conquest. And by the right of conquest, I mean that territories become the ownership of empires or states after they conquer them. So Palestinian legal scholars like Saadi Bseiso basically say, you know, Zionists claim that Arabs took Palestine from them, but, you know, it was the Romans who took Palestine from the Arabs, and then the Arabs took it from the Romans. They didn't take it from the Jews. And then there was no Jewish demand for sovereignty or return to Palestine, because according to Jewish faith, Jews are not supposed to establish a sovereign entity in Palestine until the Messiah returns. So, yeah, sorry, like there was no sign at Palestine's gate that says, you know, hey, other people, do not inhabit this land or build it, because guess what? Zionism will return 2,000 years later and establish the state of Israel. This is ridiculous. You know what I'm saying? So, like, but the question for me again is, in what context? I don't take Jordan Peterson seriously. I think he's a complainer who's building his entire career on. But at the same time, I understand the scale of his influence and impact, and that a lot of young people follow this dude. And I think, you know, we should be proactive in making this narrative much more accessible, and in making this history enjoyable, so that Reem can enjoy. I'm not sure if Reem still dislikes history, but this is the challenge for us, right? Like, how do we, and this is also on Palestinian academics and scholars, you know, to stop talking about Palestine in this jargony language within academic, behind academic walls, and go out and talk to the community and talk to people and talk to the aunts and the uncles. And this is an internal effort too, okay, I'm glad Reem enjoyed. Whew. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, sorry, this took me on a whole like tangent, but yeah.
Thanks, Jihad. I was thinking the same thing, Rania, when you're asking the question. Is I feel like because of like the last year or so of social media, social justice conversations, that things have become like easy target buzzwords, and they're not. And I think that's something that's being weaponized now, that they can say this word and people will believe it because that's a cool word to know and use now. So I think that, like what Rania just put in the chats, the importance of Pak's work and Jihad's work. And I have so much that I wrote down. I can't wait till you publish your dissertation so I can cite you and use it in my own work. And I'm really excited to read it when you have the final publication out. It is 9:30, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If there are things that you still want to unpack or questions, or you need to process it and you think of them tomorrow, just let us know. You have my email. I can share the questions with Jihad too if he has any time to think through these through email, and I can share that with you. Thank you all for a great class. Please help me in thanking Jihad, our amazing guest speaker, who we love and we enjoy bringing you in every single year to do this. Please remember to fill out that Google Doc for our video testimonials. It's really helpful for us to be able to let other people know that this class exists and why this educational work is important. And it's going to help us with like marketing and just also just having our backs. I think that these classes are important. So please sign up for those, and we will see you next week. And thank you again, Jihad.
Of course, my pleasure.
Thanks,
Good luck, everyone, and be in touch if you have any questions.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
All right, take
Have a
care.
good night. Thanks so much.